This Notebook LM video highlights the evolution from martyrdom to persecution, when disagreement with the Church was turned into a crime against the state. Protestant reformers repeating similar patterns, the Inquisition, and the bloody religious conflicts. Centuries of violence led to the radical idea of separating church and state to protect freedom of belief.
Let's talk about one of the most unbelievable and frankly disturbing reversals in all of human history. It's the story of how a faith that was literally built on the backs of persecuted martyrs turned into a global power that would hunt down its own dissenters with fire and with the sword. And this, right here, is the central paradox in a nutshell. On one side, the cross is the ultimate symbol of a victim executed by the state. On the other, it's a symbol brandished by enforcers for the state. How in the world does it go from one to the other? It's a truly mind-bending journey. Seriously, how on earth does a shift that dramatic actually happen? Well, to understand it, we've got to look at a few key turning points that completely change the game. So our story really kicks off with the first and, honestly, the biggest turning point of all. And it wasn't some complex theological argument that lit the fuse. Nope. It was a complete 180-degree change in Christianity's relationship with the one thing that changes everything: state power. Now, to really get this, we first need to understand how the meaning of one very important word got flipped on its head: heresy. You see, in the early church, being a heretic just meant you had a different opinion on theology. It was a spiritual mistake, sure, but it wasn't a crime. You gotta keep that in mind because its meaning is about to be completely weaponized. What's so wild is just how fast this all happened. I mean, look at this timeline. In 303 AD, if you're a Christian, you're being hunted by the Roman Empire. Fast forward to 380 AD, well within a single person's lifetime, and your faith is the official state religion. Just imagine that for a second. Imagine being born into a persecuted minority and dying as a member of the state-sanctioned majority. Your entire world has been turned upside down. And just like that, everything changed. Disagreeing with the church was no longer a private spiritual matter. Suddenly, it was a crime against the state itself, a threat to the unity of the entire empire. In a single generation, the persecuted had basically inherited the persecutor's sword. And then, get this, just 5 years after Christianity becomes the state religion, a line is crossed that can never be uncrossed. A theologian named Priscillian is executed by the state for heresy. This was huge. It was the very first time Christians used state power to kill another Christian over a disagreement in doctrine. And yeah, a lot of church leaders at the time were absolutely horrified by this. But it was too late. The genie was out of the bottle. A terrible new precedent had been set. So that dangerous new standard, it kind of lay dormant for a while, but it never really went away. Now let's fast forward a few hundred years, and we see it evolve from just a single shocking event into something way, way more terrifying. A systematic, bureaucratic machine designed for suppression. And if you want to know just how brutal this new phase was, you only need to hear this one, frankly terrifying quote. It came during a crusade in southern France. A crusade against other Christians, by the way. The soldiers supposedly asked how to tell the heretics from the faithful. The reply? Kill them all. God will know his own. That one line tells you everything you need to know about the kind of fanatical violence that had just been unleashed. But this wasn't just mob violence. Oh no, it was institutionalized. The church created a whole formal process for this, the Inquisition. It was organized, bureaucratic terror. As you can see here, it starts with trained friars investigating and interrogating, often with torture. Then, once they got a guilty verdict, the church used this clever legal loophole. They wouldn't carry out the execution themselves. They would just hand the heretic over to the state to be burned at the stake. And all of this brings us to what might be the biggest, most bitter irony in this entire story, the Protestant Reformation. Here you have a movement that started as a powerful call for freedom of conscience. But as soon as it got a taste of power, what did it do? It turned around and started crushing the consciences of anyone who disagreed with it. The pattern wasn't just repeating itself, it was getting a brand new engine. I mean, this table just lays the contradiction bare. Look at the left column. These are the demands. Freedom of conscience. Now look at the right, the actions. Drowning Anabaptists, which was a sick, twisted mockery of their belief in adult baptism. The demand was scripture alone, but the action was burning a man alive for his interpretation of that very same scripture. They rejected the Pope's authority only to set up their own rigid, state-enforced religions. And the tragic case of Michael Servetus is the perfect example of this. This guy was a brilliant thinker who was already on the run from the Catholic Inquisition. But his beliefs were also considered heretical by the Protestant leader John Calvin. So when Servetus made the mistake of passing through Calvin's city of Geneva, he was arrested, tried, and burned at the stake. Think about that. He was hunted by the Catholics only to be executed by the Protestants. There was no escape. But this brutal act did cause a backlash. A theologian named Sebastian Castillo responded with this simple, powerful, and absolutely devastating line. It is, no joke, one of the earliest and clearest arguments for religious toleration in Europe, an idea that was literally forged in the fires of watching the persecutors become the persecutors. And all of this bloodshed, all this horror, it leads us to our final turning point. The slow, agonizing realization that trying to force everyone to believe the exact same thing wasn't just cruel, it was completely self-destructive. The cost of intolerance became so unbelievably high that it eventually, and very painfully, pushed Europe toward a whole new way of thinking. You see, for more than 100 years after the Reformation, Europe just tore itself apart in a frenzy of religious wars. These weren't just battles, they were continental catastrophes. We're talking millions dead, entire generations wiped out. And all of it, every last bit, was in the name of forcing one true version of Christianity on everyone else. And to get a sense of this horror on a really human level, just look at this number, 30,000. That's how many people are thought to have died in the St. Bartholomew's Day massacre. This wasn't a battle. This was a state-approved mass murder, where Catholic mobs just went on a rampage, slaughtering French Protestants for weeks on end, fueled by pure religious hatred. So after centuries of this madness, of just total and complete exhaustion, a new solution finally started to gain traction. Thinkers like John Locke began championing a really radical idea, an idea designed specifically to break that toxic link between religious authority and state power, the separation of church and state. Now, this whole bloody history, it leaves behind a deep psychological scar, and it actually helps us understand a modern concept you might have heard of, the persecution complex. This is when the memory of very real, very traumatic historical suffering becomes so baked into a group's identity that they start to see any modern criticism or even just a loss of cultural power as the exact same thing as the persecution their ancestors faced. You know, the temptation to use power to enforce belief, that didn't just vanish in the 18th century, it just learned to speak new languages. So the final question I'll leave you with is this. Where do we see this pattern today? What modern belief systems, and they could be political, social, anything, are using new forms of power to punish their own heretics? That's definitely something we're thinking about.